People seem to forget, if you change today, today will change your life. Matt, welcome back to the podcast. How are you doing?
Awesome. Thank you. It's great to be back with you, David.
No, it's great to have you back. And I really enjoyed our conversation last time and certainly wanted to get you back. And for those of you who heard Matt last time, or those of you who are hearing Matt for the first time, Matt is a difference maker devoted to personally enriching the lives of 100 million people by 2025. And his new book, Zedisms, or Zisms, depending on where you are in the world, Insights to Live By, is based on his experience as an entrepreneur, athlete, single parent, caretaker, and nonprofit founder. And Matt is also the soon-to-be host of Insights to Live By, which is a podcast that invites guests to share their own pearls of wisdom. And he's also the CEO of the Internship Institute as well, which he established in 2007 to make experience matter. Matt, with the podcast, you must be really proud to be starting that, and I'm really excited as well.
I am. It's, coming off of the book, in some ways I've been wanting to just let things unfold. And that's really what's happened with the podcast. And now I'm in high gear, getting ready for my initial episodes. July 7th is when we're looking at airing that.
Just on talking about podcast, because it's just one of those areas that I think 5-10 years ago, no one would have, if you said, oh, just this, and this medium where you just listen to something, I think most people would be like, well, that's never going to become anything. And podcasts are huge. Like, everyone listens to podcasts. They're absolutely huge. I don't know. Are you surprised by the growth of podcasts?
Well, I'm still getting my arms around it. I think it's amazing. And it speaks a lot to just somewhat of an awakening, I think, where people are there's a greater expansion of interest in pursuits of personal development, which is as positive as it gets. So I don't have a baseline enough to be surprised. Not too many things surprised me to begin with, so I'll leave it at that.
And so I wanted you back on because we were going through just your book. I mean, the chapters in your book have got some really interesting titles anyway, but just so many different areas that we just simply didn't get time around to covering all of it. And I just want to start off by going back to just some of those chapters and really getting the insights that you've put into the book. So you've got a section making coincidences meaningful. I think so many people, I always say to people that people have momentum developing their entire life. They just don't recognize it. And we've got a brain that's designed to point out what's wrong and what's not good. And we always say things like, oh, this has gone wrong. I bet something else wrong is going to be just around the corner. And trying to get people to notice, well, if something goes right, why is it that we just don't go, oh, I bet something else good's going to come around the corner? I'd love to hear more about making coincidences meaningful, if I can say it for once.
It's honestly, the same thing happens to me. It's my chapter. I'm like, what is it about this word? You just kind of trip over it a little bit.
Yeah.
It really is something that I have a great passion for in my own personal experience. And it really is a personal experience for people, and that decision as to whether, to whatever degree they do encounter a coincidence, whether you call it that or you can call it by some other name. People say, well, I don't really believe in coincidences, but really it's kind of the same experience in one way, shape, or form. We talked about swimming with the current last time. We talked about trusting your gut, going with the flow, all of these things that are in and around mindfulness. And so coincidences are also on that spectrum of being in the flow and grounding yourself in gratitude, in alignment with the law of attraction, for example. In my personal experience and belief, I see coincidences as happening on a spectrum. And so you might think, oh, well, I was just thinking of David Holman. I haven't talked to that guy in 4 months. Boom, there you are, that same day. Or a lot of people talk about, I just heard about something 3 times in a row. What they say about three times, you should take action or go get something. If you hear about Zisms 3 times, that would be a good thing. I like that. The other is something that gets a little bit more increasingly unlikely. So you and I are across the pond from one another, and I happen to take a trip, and we've met a couple of times, and I run into you, That's a little bit,
Mm.
more of in terms of the odds, but it really all comes down to coincidences being, in my view, an opportunity that you either pursue or not, depending on what they mean to you. When I get to the farther side of the spectrum, where the odds of that coincidence are really astronomical, and I've had this happen to me a number of times in my life, I absolutely pay attention. When you're sitting there, like, what are the odds?
Mhm.
Well, that would be a real indicator of maybe tuning in. That often, it's not in every time, and you can speak to this for yourself as well. It happens when you're in a conversation with somebody you don't know very well, that the purpose of that conversation was one thing, and then at some point it veers off, typically later in the
I get
conversation,
that. Yeah.
to something that you really never had any business talking to that person about. And then it intersects with something, and it unfolds. And that would be where, whatever that intersection is, something that is beyond unlikely. Is that something that I'm going to
Yeah,
turn the interview around. Does
I
that
don't.
sound like?
I was just trying to think through of like specific moments when you were talking about that, and you know, the first sort of thing that was coming to mind, and I'm sure it's not the only sort of thing you're referring to, is that when someone you haven't met, and it's to the side which is to do with, say, rapport or attraction. When you meet someone, not even necessarily relationship context, where you meet someone, and I can think of situations where you just meet someone for a particular person, and you just start, you just somehow manage to talk about something that you both have an interest in, or that you both, for whatever reason, it it just sparks something, and that feeling of rapport or whatever, that's just instant. I guess some people call it chemistry. It's just something which you can't buy, but sometimes just comes across. And it's one of the things where if I in any walk of life feel that feeling with someone, it really captures my attention, as to, especially if it's I'm meeting that person for the first time. I sort of think, whoa, where's that come from? Or how weird is it that I'd meet someone and actually we'd be so aligned in terms of the direction that we're going in, that it just makes more and more sense. But when you talk about coincidences, that sort of type of coincidence, and that will be only one thing of the many different examples that you're referring to,
Right.
is something that, it's a coincidence, but at some point, yeah, somewhere down the line, there are only a certain amount of patterns, different patterns that human beings have. You're going to find those people. It's just when and how and where. So those are the examples that sprung to my
Sure.
mind. But what other situations might you be referring to?
Well, also part of it is how much you are in alignment with gratitude and being in the flow. Whether you call that a law of attraction related experience, again, I'll leave it to the individual. I did have something happen only a few weeks ago that very rarely I was able to know what the odds of that coincidence were. It'll take a minute or two to explain here. I'll just jump
Please,
in if
yeah.
that's okay.
Yeah.
So I met somebody on LinkedIn from Australia, and 14 hours in my future. And she asked, she was somewhat of a coach, but she said, well, why don't we hop on a Zoom and meet? And, of all the people that you meet on LinkedIn to begin with, I mean, you might have an
Sure.
exchange,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
But not many people, for really no reason at all, say, hey, let's hop on and just get to know each other. I was like, okay, well, so I had a nice conversation. And similarly as described, I mentioned to her that I was recently on a podcast, and we were in the after chat, and the podcaster mentioned to me, hey, have you ever thought of starting your own? I said, oh, I really hadn't. I'm really enjoying these interviews I'm doing, but yeah, I would do 10 of them a day if I could.
Right.
And so I started thinking about it. And so I told her I was interested in exploring this. She said, well, I am actually just going into a course next week with this woman who is giving it for free. It's invitation only. She herself is, oh, I'm interested in podcasting too, right? That obviously is now
Mm-hmm.
in taking that course. I'll check in and see if you can be a part of it. So I'm trying to
Right.
make that long story shorter. So I get the email, and I say, yes, no problem. Welcome to have him. And then you go through the entire sign up. And then after something like this, you go and say, well, introduce yourself in our Facebook group. And so this is where I'll come back to the baseline point that I've been using a hashtag, which is Be the Difference, for a few years now. It had initially started with the Internship Institute, all things work-based learning, apprenticeships, called different things around the world. And of course, it certainly flows right into everything I'm doing now. And it's my hashtag, right? I have a great affinity for it. So I go into the Facebook group and I look at the masthead, and this woman, Anne Marie Cross, she had the same one, Be the Difference, which I thought was nice. I mean, like, you think, oh, this hashtag, that hashtag, but it's not that typical of a hashtag.
No.
It's one of the reasons why I chose it to begin with. And it's been used a little bit more recently. But the other thing I found interesting was that when I went back to the group, it wasn't there anymore. She changes out her headers, her
Okay.
banners on her profile. So if I hadn't gone and seen it when I saw
Yeah.
it, right? So I thought that was really interesting. And then even more so when you go to the right where the written post is, and it's there, and I click it, I'm at the top of it. My video is at the top of it. So that was an
Okay.
interesting experience.
Right. Okay.
And so the point of that with the measurement of it is, obviously you can look up how much hashtags are used.
Hmm.
So the minimal odds, had we used it each once, is 1 in 80,000. Now, you use
Wow.
hashtags
Okay.
multiple times. So I've certainly used it more than 5, but if you just go out 5 times, we're 1 in 400,000 people, plus the multiplier of her not using it all the time. So I was like, okay, I'm fascinated about coincidences to begin with. What is this all about? And it's already has me on the path of pursuing a podcast. I start to wonder, well, who's this person? Who's that person? Are they somebody to bring into my life? I had a wonderful time in Anne Marie's presentations throughout the week in her workshop. I just learned a ton. I'm still absorbing it. And it really did convince me to move forward with my podcast. To me, it was the indicator that, yes, you're on the right path. At the very least, keep going. So people can look at coincidences and say, well, it's the event itself that makes it meaningful. And then you could say it's because I took the opportunity and pursued something that I may not have otherwise, is what makes it meaningful. But either way, I'm not sure which matters. It's something that you have to take action and pursue. And so now I am into action, and I am really excited the book's done. It's in the can, as it were. And now I've got something new of a project that is expansive.
I mean, uh, that is that is a really interesting story. And when I was listening to all of that, that particular story happened after you wrote your book. I'm right in thinking that.
Right. After I wrote my
So
book and started doing interviews,
yeah,
and the idea of doing a podcast had just come up. And then I had the conversation with Pix, who's the LinkedIn connection. And then she introduced me to Anne Marie, where I learned enough about podcasts to know it's what I wanted to do.
and so the reason why I asked that question is because you'd obviously written on this chapter in terms of making coincidence meaningful, which means therefore you had some awareness that you're looking out for these moments, not consciously looking out, but you've got this thing where it's like, well, maybe if you've got to the point where you hadn't sort of done your research and investigated and written that chapter and everything else, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, whether you feel this or not. Do you think, in terms of the fact that you're looking for these, let's call it an opportunity, that you could that allowed you to turn the coincidence into the opportunity? And is that something people need to do? People need to be consciously aware of noticing that coincidence ahead of time, not just a feeling in the moment. They should be aware of it beforehand, so that they can turn these coincidences into opportunities.
That's a great question. Again, with everything happening on a spectrum, a coincidence like this is one of those, hits you over the head. Whereas you might have something more subtle that you can decide whether it matters to you or not, or the topic of the coincidence and how that folds
Yeah.
in or
Okay.
intersects with you in your life, for what it is that's important to you, or opens you up to your why, and takes you in a certain direction. But that I don't know if you have this expression, but the cart and the horse, the chicken and the egg, right?
Sure.
You know, what comes before the other? It's hard to know. I think it's really more about the end result. I don't feel that I'm somebody, even with my passion for this topic, having it in the book, that I just go around completely aware of looking for coincidences. Uh, Mindfully in a proactive way. It is just something that has to kind of come to you, but it's really about that bell going off, and what you do about it.
Hmm. I really like that. I just think I think people miss those. People always wanting someone to open the door for them. I think they just people just they're not. There's a phrase that I often use, which is "fail to prepare, prepare." Sorry, fail to prepare, prepare to fail. And often part of that preparation is also being experienced enough. Part of that preparation is having enough knowledge to know when a door is open, when a coincidence is more than a coincidence.
Right.
If you haven't got all that information, that preparation, if you were doing nothing to do with podcasts and looking into it and everything else, then all of that stuff, then that moment might have meant nothing to you. But it's that part of
Right.
that's the preparation and having an understanding so that you can recognize when a door is opening for you. I think that's really, really important, because most people feel like the opportunity is not there. Well, the reality is the door does open at some point.
Right. And you made a really great point. When is a coincidence more than a coincidence? And I don't want to overstate the fact that just because you hear something three times,
Hmm.
makes it something you absolutely need to, or that there is any particular meaning behind it, or that you have the opportunity to create meaning that wasn't there, even with that event happening in the
Mm,
first place. It's really a personal decision, and what it is that really strikes a certain chord with someone that is important enough to them, or curious enough to typically at the onset, that motivates them to do anything about it.
absolutely. I totally agree with that. Um, I want to move on to one of the other sections, which is caught my attention, which is we didn't talk about last time, the natural elements of motion. And you sort of touching on sort of psychological traits here. I just want to get a better understanding and a better idea of what that is to you.
Right. Well, actually, it's something very specific. This was an experience that I had, and I guess it's the one thing that makes this chapter stand apart, because it really is mostly all about this event, which is close to 20 years ago. I had a friend working at a place called Esalen in Big Sur, California, right on the Pacific coast. If you ever see car commercials where they're right along the ocean on the windy highway,
Okay. Yeah.
that's Big Sur.
Okay.
Beautiful. And Esalen functioned something like a commune, and she worked there as a kindergarten teacher. So I went out to visit her, stayed on the property. She's working during the day, and they do different somewhat alternative workshops, which at that time, mind body connection 20 years
Mhm.
ago was
Yeah. Sure.
more out of the ordinary. So I'm this I'm from Philadelphia. I'm an East Coast guy. I'm out there now. I'm definitely a fish out of water, uh, sore thumb, call it what you want. I was, you know, uh, a jock, I guess, as a hockey player, and it was something I really had to open myself up to begin with, and it was this intensive course, about 36 hours in 6 days, and we went through a lot. So I really do have to cliff note this to size it down, but it's focusing on the four natural elements in a quadrant. Now, there's an illustration in the book with this in it. It is easy enough to describe that in the lower quadrants, to the left you have water, and to the right you have earth, as they are in nature on the ground. And then in the upper quadrants, you have air to the left and fire to the right.
Sure.
And then we talked about the motion of the elements. And so just by quick reference, fire is it's a forward upward type of element, and so they related it to people and their personalities. So in this case, people who are type A, who are more aggressive, who have that tendency to walk. You see someone in an airport and they're walking fast in a forward motion, almost tilted over,
Mhm.
tilted forward. They are typically, at least an innate character trait, fire. If it's somebody who is, they let things roll off their shoulders, what we might say here in the States, or maybe you do there, surfer dude. right? Like,
Right. Yeah.
yeah, whatever, right?
Hmm.
And then you might be someone who is water, and you are, easily pushed back. If you think of a canoe and you push it in equal force, it's going to repel in opposite directions. So that might be somebody who is a little bit of a pushover, can be taken advantage of, maybe a lower self-esteem. I don't. It's hard to categorize it in any one way from an element standpoint. And then I think everyone can also relate to earth, and an earthy person who's well grounded, who is not someone who necessarily will push, but they're not someone who can necessarily be pushed. And so just wanted to give that as a framework, because we all, even in corporate culture, look at these different models that, oh, this person's personality is red and that person's
Yeah.
blue, and here's how they interact, right? All this organizational psychology
Hmm.
type things. But this is the thing that really stuck with me and that I can put into action through the years. And at that age, one of the ways it helped me especially is to get out of my own way in conflict. And by that, I mean, we're looking at things and applying those elements circumstantially. Oh, and by the way, it also states that people have more of an innate element that they're born with, but it's very possible to, live life as another one that you are through experience. So nature versus nurture. So I would say I'm probably fiery element by nature. By nurture, I am earth.
Hmm. Okay.
I have, my wife would say I have a maddening amount of patience. So a fire person would not be able to do that. So that's a good indicator. Not that that has to come into play too often, David. But the point is that when you're in a conflict, and this is something we talked about last time around areas of perception, and two people are seeing a situation in different ways, naturally in completely opposite ways, doesn't necessarily make either one of them wrong based on the perception of the situation. So that whole thing around, two rights don't make a wrong, but one person's I'm right, I'm right. How do you get your ego in check when you're like that? And so in that moment, the application of this model, just by example, is to remind yourself that, number one, fire plus fire makes more fire. You're going to take a conflict and you're going to ignite it into something greater. So now's when we're talking about, there was no social media back then, so you could say, a week's worth of angry emails or texts or things of that nature. Is that worth it? When you're in that moment and you want to decide whether to push forward because it's so important to you to be right, is it more important to you just to yield and not put yourself and others through that? Because then you start repeating that story to multiple people, and that's a negative energy that gets spread, and on and on and on. I know you get all this, but again, at that age, it was something I really had a hard time getting out of my own way in a certain way, and not that I'm often in conflict, but wanting to be right. And I have a choice in that moment to stay grounded and stay poised and decide that I can act as another element, in this case water, and douse the flame and say, David, I get where you're coming from and why you're so passionate about this. I have a difference of opinion here, and I don't really see the benefit of us arguing it out. We're not going to agree here.
Hmm.
And
That's a
and then what are you going to say, right? I just
Yeah.
diffuse the situation. Uh, Go ahead, David. What are you going to say to that? You're
Well,
hot. You want to be right.
I was gonna. It takes me back to some of the work that I do, I guess, in terms of modes of being, which is, I guess, a similar sort of concept in terms of, um, you have the warrior, the lover, the sovereign, the joker, the different places we can come from, and some people are more driven by feeling important, and some people are more driven by love. And actually, that whilst you might be driven by one or the other, actually,
Right.
what does life look like when you drive yourself through the other filter? And that's often an interesting question. So anyway, so sorry for jumping in, but
No,
I
I wouldn't
totally.
consider that jumping in. I think I was on a diatribe for about, felt like 8 minutes or
No,
so there. So
so I've just, so on that particular point that you were speaking about, which and carrying on your story, which is understanding. It's not. I won't ask the question when to use which one, because that's obviously a personal preference, but more an understanding of, I guess, in what situations people can make more of a conscious effort to think, maybe I need to do it from a different place. You spoke about conflict. Maybe there are other situations that you think of actually, maybe I need to do it from a different place, or a different place, different place. So anyway, to carry on your story, just interesting to know in other ways in which that stuff can be applied.
yeah, again, it's one of those things that, you mentioned another model. What is it that someone identifies with that hits home? And to me, this has always been very simple. Again, I think the natural element aspect of it's pretty cool, and it's easy to apply. Then again, the expression there would be, I think it would be a little flaky to go around and be like, oh, she's fire and he's air, and that's not it. It's more of a go-to, when you need it. To just make the good decisions and keep yourself in check, understand other people. It's just always stood the test of time for me.
So and how fiery do you feel these days?
It depends, and fire having different definitions, right? You might have positive fire around passion, and you might have the negative around anger. I feel pretty passionate, so I've got good fuel. I'll say that. But I do like to think I remain pretty grounded. I really do take pride in being Earth in this example.
Um, you touched on terms of fire being passion and fire being anger, and obviously everything is a sort of a gift and a curse to some degree. Can you speak a little bit to people listening, be interested in thinking, they'll be thinking, oh, I wonder which one I am, but also understanding what comes with that. And so I don't know if you can speak to when you're earth, or when you're the other ones, in terms of what are some of the, without kind of wanting to simplify it too much, what are the good qualities about that particular area, and what are the qualities that you might be, say, a little bit more, what's the fair way of saying it, might be more vulnerable in some way, if that makes some. So for example, the fire example, you might be slightly more vulnerable to getting angry, but also it gives you that option, that to have that passion, enthusiasm, and drive is really important. So can you speak to the other elements in terms of what the good and sort of less good points are?
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. For one, coming back to for a moment to, is this something you identify with or not? You could read the chapter and hear what we're talking about and be like, this is, I don't get it. And if that's the case, this is not for you. I don't know for any listener now saying, oh, I get this. I'm really, I can get revved up really easily. But I understand I can make a choice of something I'm completely not under a particular circumstance to what ultimately will be my benefit, and be able to keep my ego in check. That's my favorite real life example, because I learned so much from that I continue to this day. Well, if we go to the opposite side and I wonder, just for a moment, we can come back to this, but whether you identify with what you are in hearing this story.
Oh,
so I'll let you think about that while I answer your question.
Yeah, good question.
Because I have the podcast coming up, so I'm just practicing. Turn the table on you. That if you're water, then you're somebody who typically can be taken advantage of. You're somebody who might have a hard time saying no. I don't recall offhand. We talked about the spider chapter and manipulators.
We spoke about it a little bit last time, right? I thought feel free to, but feel free just for the people listening to just to summarize.
Well, that's the example.
Yeah.
In terms of how it would apply as someone who's being taken advantage of by a manipulator, and how do you stand up for yourself? How do you, or bully? Those kinds of things come in, and you push back. You have to be the opposite. You have to be a little bit fiery, and that might not be something that's an innate quality for you. But circumstantially, when you're getting bullied, or someone's sensing vulnerability, that you're somebody who has a hard time saying no, and so they want to take advantage of you, you know what, there are some other practical ways to make that decision in the right moment. So and there's some different crossovers here as we're already getting into. And another one would be at the foundation of the book. We certainly talked about earned confidence and being rooted in gratitude and recognizing that you've been through everything you have, and you'll make it through everything that comes your way as example. And you can just stay in the present and deal with things. And around that is the notion of kindness, which is another common thread through the book and certainly very applicable at all times, sometimes more than others. And the practicality of it is that if we're talking about things like self-esteem, self-love, things that can be somewhat elusive from more, they almost feel more conceptual than something, they're almost too big to be able to get your arms around. But if you go back and you rely on kindness and you say, well, why be anything less than kind to myself? Now, if you can't say, if you can't answer that affirmatively, then that's really where, you need to go back to that building block and know why. But let's assume that most people get that. It's like, yeah, of course. Well, you have to get the buy-in. So now if you're back into the decision of having a hard time saying no, the question to ask then is, well, would it be kind to myself to say yes?
I like that.
And that really, I mean, of all things in the book, honestly, David, that is the one thing I do come back to, having had many conversations about it now, that at the heart of all of this, that building block is being kind to yourself, certainly kindness when it comes to others and karma, right? We go in that direction too. But in this example, that being the case, no, you don't want to say yes. Because if you do, your self-esteem is going to take a hit. You're going to feel terrible about the thing you knew you should have said no to. And it's a building block for you to say, you know what, I'm going to kind of step out of my comfort zone and not be a people pleaser here. And this person who's trying to impose their will on me, and just say, I really appreciate what you're trying to accomplish, but I have other things going on for me right now, and it's just not something I can do. But if it makes you feel better, make a suggestion. But and then that's a great builder for your self-esteem and pride. So a watery person can apply that in that way. I know we're crossing models here, but when we get to the end of the book where things are practical and we go through this 90-day life enrichment action plan, this framework that culminates, we're going back and looking at all these things. Who are the spiders in your life? What element are you? Who, go through who's your tribe, and then we talk about crossing these things over in ways that are being described now, and if you identify them, how do you apply those?
I'm gonna have to come back to the question of which one I am, because I'm still thinking about it. But
I was giving you plenty of time to think about it.
I'm still not entirely sure. I think for some reason instinctively I feel like I'm leaning towards Earth, but I can definitely recognize the tones of the other things as well. One of the last things you just said then, I really actually want to touch on, which is the amount of clients I have that say, I'm really good at helping everyone else, but why can't I do it for myself? And one of the last things you said was, in terms of the, sort of one of the action steps in your book, what is your tribe? Who is your tribe?
Right.
And just to talk a little bit about that is why it's, I tell people that, well, you have to have a tribe because at the beginning of time, you had to have a tribe of people or a community of people to survive. If you were isolated, you would die. Now, that's not the case anymore, but the brain's built the same way. So your brain's still looking for a community, still looking for a tribe.
Right.
Now, aside from that, people can go kind of nod along and go, okay, that's the way my brain's designed. But why can't I help myself? And I say to people, they ask me, well, how do I help myself? I say, well, part of it is exactly what you say, is implying all of these things to yourself, but also you have to have designated people to have conversations with, to get the stuff out your head, just like anyone else does. You need a community or tribe of people for plenty of reasons, including your own well-being.
Right.
I just want to get your thought on why it's so important to identify, not just know whether conceptually maybe I have a tribe, maybe I don't.
Right.
Why it's important to know who exactly is in your tribe.
Right. Well, to take the half step back, I will say, because it's also about people. I mean, we don't know each other quite well yet, but I do find it fairly easy to apply the elements model in most cases. And you can work backwards and say, well, what is this person not? I could tell you you're not fire. You don't strike me as a fiery individual. You're not a type A. type
No, I agree with
person.
that.
That's,
I
you don't have to
can
get to
be,
know
but
you.
I think instinctively I'm not. Yeah.
Right. The element, it's just not
Yeah.
at your core. I don't really see you as someone as water. So,
Mm.
that leaves the other two. So, and you will kind of toggle from one to the next. So you do strike me, you're a life coach, all the things that you do through your experience and profession, you're going to be earth more than likely, if nothing else, through that life experience. And you're probably also air. You don't really strike me as somebody who lets things get to you. You strike me as somebody who lets things roll off your shoulders,
I would. It
as
depends who.
air
It
would.
depends who you ask. I think in my life, so
All
most
right.
people, lots of people go no, and then I can think of a few people who would go yes. But
All
you're
right.
probably right, mostly.
Okay. Well, we'll put it to the test when we're done the podcast. We get off air here. I'll try and see what you can tolerate, and
Yeah, try to piss
we'll
me
put you through the
off.
speed test. So going back to the tribe, quite directly, it's really along the lines of the comment that we, to a large degree, are the sum of the 5 people that we spend the most time with. And that can be family, that can be immediate family, spouse, certainly your friends, and how they influence you. And so at the onset of again, the practical side of how this is about life quality and enrichment is, well, who's in that tribe that either that we're going back to that thin slice, that data point of, do they feed me energetically or do they
Mm,
drain me energetically? And of course, we're there to lean on each other, right? When life events happen and difficulties, again, these things needing to be dealing with the real, not necessarily being unnecessary worry.
sure.
Boy, I'm really getting into lots of crossovers here between one
Yeah, it's
chapter
interesting
and the
though.
next,
Yeah.
but it's true. And so now you can make a conscious decision in the initial reference I made to that 90-day plan and say, might there be somebody among those 5 people who just drains me all the time, sucks the life out of me? It's just, they
Yeah.
don't mean
Yeah.
it. They have their dysfunctions. It's not anything intentional. They're just a drama magnet, whatever that. Everybody understands what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
so you can make a conscious decision to say, I love this person. It could be a family member. However, it's not your spouse.
Mm,
Um, but the idea that, you have to be aware of that and be mindful to keep that energy at bay. You can be there to lean on for this person, but
mm,
you got to keep your shields up. And at the same time, it's, well, who else is in my life that lifts me up,
mm.
that I can, again, make a conscious choice, which obviously is to reach out and go have coffee, when,
Yeah.
when that's more
Yeah.
possible, virtual coffee,
Hmm.
and exchange that. And this came into action for me just yesterday, the day before, and somebody needed me unexpectedly, and I went and solved something, and it took a number of hours, and I made it through, no problem, in a poised way. But I was a little drained after it, and I needed to recharge. And I said, well, who do I want to call? It was my friend Camille. We go way back, and every time I talk to her, she always lifts my spirits. So I get her on the phone, and I said, I need to talk to you. I just want to have a conversation. You can talk about yourself. I just know the energy exchange is going to be something that's going to kind of
Yeah.
help me level out. And it did. We had a few good laughs. And those are the kind of practical things that you want to do, and just a lifestyle basis, and making conscious decisions to take care of yourself. Be kind to yourself. It's not kind to yourself if you're letting somebody drain you.
Mm. I like that. And to go on to, you touched on that point in terms of a lot of coffees are virtual coffees at the moment, a lot of encounters are virtual encounters. A lot of people at the moment struggling with motivation because there's just less options, or their usual way of life is disrupted. We talk about a little bit beforehand when we talk about motivation, which is, I'm amazed at how few people understand their why in anything,
Right.
and understanding. And to ask you the question, why it is that you think so many people don't know or don't ever work out what their why is. And you spoke
Sure.
a little bit about an interesting concept of the area of inevitability as well, which I'd be interested to hear about. But
Yeah.
why do you think so many people don't know or ever work out their why?
I think the why in part is something at times that can be innate. Generically speaking, I've always known my why is the passion and satisfaction, the fulfillment of making a difference,
Hmm.
whatever that is, and being able to home in on that. For other people, it comes at a particular inflection point. Maybe when they have a little bit more space in their life, just raised a family, my kids are off to college, and what now? And they might have to seek it out in a proactive way. May not be something that comes to them. But again, it's like everything we're talking about. It's about taking action. Even if you know your why, you still have to take a lot of action. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
So, for me, let's say with the book, and we may have mentioned this last time, but I did, I am at that point. My son just just started college, and I have a little bit more time, and I wanted to revisit this, which I do every few years, or just in terms of those those life paths, and what would I regret not doing? That's the question that I asked myself. It's in the book, in this chapter, and the book, whatever it was to be at the time, has been a thorn in my side for 10 or 15 years. Earn confidence, beware of spiders, the elements, all these things. I just wanted to get them down. I felt a personal responsibility to share them. Really kind of being in the bubble, not knowing how much I'm not. When I was younger, I consumed a fair amount of personal development books, but I really have been in the bubble with my nonprofit and family. So I just went for it. I wasn't like, okay, I'm writing this book right now. It was, okay, these are things that I've been thinking about for a long time. Let me spend a couple of days and get into action. Let me start writing. And then when I was 2 days in, I looked back and I was like, wow, there's seems like there might be a book here. And it was almost like it was too much to turn back. I had already been into action and had that momentum. Sometimes that's what you just have to do to get yourself going, is to explore something. If I got to the point and say, no, I got 3 chapters here, I don't know what, nothing else comes to mind. It might be a 3-chapter book, at best, a blog. That's what it would have been. Right. So I think it's just something that, it's not for everybody either. People just want to spend their, look, it's everyone's individual decision how they spend their life, what brings them joy. If they want to binge watch one show after the other and never step out of off their couch, then more power to you. There's, that's what you decide. And we can get into inevitability as well, but I want to take pause. And anything more you want to explore on this part of the conversation?
Well, I just think that in terms of people's why, you're right. It is each to their own in terms of what it is they want to do. And I always say, whatever you're spending most of your time doing, you use the example in terms of people not getting off the couch. The amount of people who will be experts in terms of binge watching a TV program because they know where to put the remote, they know where to put their drink, they know where to do this, and they've done it so many times and so many times they know how to be an expert at it. And everyone's an expert at something. It's just asking yourself, well, where do you spend most of your time? And then it's measuring that against what it is that you want. And I say to everyone, I said to a client this morning, I did all this work on her business and then said, this is all rubbish if we don't know the answer to the following question, which is not why do you want to do this? Why is it a must for you?
Right.
She'd sort of said, she'd spoken about, I want to do it because it'll be good for me. It'll help with this. And I said, no, why is it a must? And she said, after a long pause, she said, and she started to well up a little bit. She said, I want to set my kids up. I want my kids to be fine. That's
right.
why I have to do this. And that's the difference I think people have to find. It's hard to find that. And lots of people struggle to do so.
Absolutely. And I should reinforce, just non-judgmentally. I like a binge watch as much as the next person.
Oh God, me too.
I just finished one last night, but
what are you watching?
I finally actually just watched Breaking Bad.
What? You've only
I never saw it.
I'm so jealous. I'm so jealous.
I just blew through 5 seasons, and the last time it's just like my late night thing.
Oh,
but so now I have more free time on my hands. What's now? What's my why now? But part of that also, I think, starts with yourself. Someone's why, if they really want to get into it, might just be all around personal development. What do I need to do to to make myself, what is the better version of myself, so I can get to the point of being able to act on, even if what I don't know it is at the time, that why. And without that framework and some discipline and just being kind to yourself, meaning you're taking care of yourself, you're staying healthy, those, all the obvious things, it's going to be very difficult to achieve any why without that foundation. So it might just start there.
It's a good point.
Start there. So inevitability. So this actually folds off of the chapter on amplifying gratitude, which visits the law of attraction, which ultimately culminates with what we expect tends to happen, which then goes back into things around not worrying, because that would be the wrong expectation. But the thing about the law of attraction is that it is transactional. It's not going to write a book for you. It's not going to necessarily succeed at whatever that why might be. It could be right now people making a pivot and pursuing something entrepreneurially. Law of attraction is not going to start that business for you on its own.
Absolutely agree.
So inevitability is somewhat about putting that law of attraction into action. And if you look at the law of attraction, which I think most people know is somewhat fueled by gratitude, and whether you subscribe to it or not, I think people recognize, well, gratitude in and to itself is really where the joy in life, the heart of it is. The fuel for inevitability is self-belief, which is naturally a good theme for us for your program.
I think someone does a podcast on that subject.
I heard of it. I can't put my finger on it.
It's not very good.
Yeah, no, that wouldn't be true. It better be, with us being here together. But this is really a somewhat in detailed chapter. So I'm going to just really try and get my head around summarizing it best. If you look at this from an entrepreneurial standpoint, an entrepreneur would typically say, I'm at point A, and here's my business plan. 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, 10 year. Those are the points that where I want to be then. But when you're looking at inevitability, you have to go all the way out to your point B. What is your furthest most vision for your business that you can be very, entirely crystal clear about, that it is to the point where you have the self-belief that it has already happened. It's inevitable, because through self-belief, you're going to reach that point B. And reaching point B in this case takes some explanation. If you look at that idea and what we talk about is our dominoes, and you line dominoes up from that point B to where you are now. For me, for example, for the nonprofit, for the Internship Institute, those are systemic things that I'm trying to affect in terms of change. I'm very clear about it, but they're decades out. Ultimately, I'm probably not going to be around with respect, and that's part of the whole thing around the nonprofit. But it's not as much now about the point B as it is knowing the tipping point that I need to get to, that once I get there through the vision I've established, the rest of the dominoes will fall. So for a lot of cases, it's, putting it more simply, it's when a business becomes profitable and is at the no look back phase. But then what happens? So I'm just touching on it here. But inevitability is self-belief, and it's about that. You just have to be, it's entrepreneurial passion and undeterrability. Something happens, you're an entrepreneur, you get punched in the gut 8 times a week, which is probably minimal. You are undeterred because you know what your point B is, and you might take detours. Your dominoes are never going to remain straight, but you know where you're heading.
I really like that, because I think I talked to a lot of people about leverage, and I guess it's a similar sort of concept in that there does get to a point where if you put enough of the right pieces in place, or let's use your domino analogy, which is that if you do line the dominoes up and then you get them in a position where once that tips, it's going to tip everything else as well. It has to turn in your favor. Now, knowing what all the dominoes look like, or using leverage as an example, knowing what was required to create enough leverage, sometimes that's hard to know straight away what all of that is that will create a significant amount of leverage. But with more understanding, experience, preparation, everything else, you start to work out, but if I do A, B, C, D, it has to create the leverage, and there has to be a sense of inevitability that it will turn in my favor. And that's why I always say to people, clarity brings things closer, because the clearer you are of what you want, then you have clearer idea of how to make it an inevitability, as you're saying. And so how much of what you talk about is and how much do you believe in terms of self-belief is clarity?
Well, clarity is, you can't go further out with that point B unless you have total clarity, because otherwise you're not going to have total self-belief if things are not crystal. And of course that point B will change over time, as you do what you do. I think it's important to make a final connection on this point. Number one, where law of attraction is concerned and how it intertwines, you still have to apply the aspects of speaking, what you say, what you think, talking about things as it rather than it will happen. It's more, I am doing this. It's trying to bring things into the present. It's trying to step into, maybe that's a new self-identity. Who are you when you're on the other side of that? I mean, and it's hard that you have to reconcile it. So for me, it's like, well, I want to personally enrich 100 million people. I'm by 2025 and beyond. That's very specific. I'm setting my sights on a goal. I have to think of myself, even though it's awkward, quite honestly, as a household name.
Mm-hmm.
But the houses don't know it yet. I know it. I have that self-belief. And I have to then put myself into the mindset of, well, what would it be like? What is it like to be that person? So that self-identity aligns with the self-belief. And then at the front end of it, it's also very important to apply the law of attraction transactionally, which might be, okay, I know what my tipping point is in that line of dominoes, still not knowing quite how to get there, but the law of attraction might help inspire that idea. It might lead to that encounter. It might lead me to the investor I need. Those sorts of, I mean, look, this, I hear myself, and it is all just somewhat of a personal experience to get to the point where you can buy into this. And I'm not here to say, it's easily sustainable, no more than the law of attraction is, but you have to fold these things into your day practically as you would gratitude, so that you can remain focused and remain aligned with that self-belief just the same.
I really like that. I like people who do good things for other people and then still have the ambition to do more, which clearly you have. And before we start thinking in terms of wrapping up this conversation and making sure people know where they can go and listen to your podcast, you kind of touched on the question I was going to finish up with, which is understanding what footsteps you want to leave behind for other people. You touched on, you mentioned you want to influence 100 million people by 2025. I guess, therefore, what I'd like to ask is, you talked about aligning that vision of yourself, aligning that vision of how that looks like, aligning that to who you currently are right now. And I buy into all of that as well. That I think that's important to work out who that version of yourself. We won't know it completely, but get as good an idea of as we possibly can of what that version of ourselves would look like, and therefore how can we align that to us now. So the question I guess I have for you, Matt, is when you think about helping 100 million people or influencing 100 million people by that point, is how will you have done that? What does that vision look like to you? In what mediums,
Sure.
what forms would you have done that?
Well, part of it is also what it eliminates. For example, I know I cannot be a coach. because
Okay.
coaching is going to be more of one-on-ones,
Sure.
and that's not going to
Hmm.
take me to the
Yeah.
masses. So the other side of that is, well, what will?
Hmm.
So the podcast is a step in that direction. I'd love to think there's 100 million followers of my podcast. I'm not sure that's a reasonable expectation,
No.
as
You can
far,
work
but
towards that
I'd
number.
like
Yeah.
to. Maybe I should make that an expectation. Back to the law of attraction, but I do want to get into motivational speaking, inspirational speaking. Certainly, social media and reach has a great play in that. I mean, I originally thought it started out, David, as I want to positively impact as many people as possible. And it sounds great and it's true, but it sounds flighty. And I wanted to be
Specific.
more specific and as an objective, how many or how much by when.
Hmm.
So that's what led to that objective. And I thought, well, 10. I said, well, if I can do 10, I can do 100, and then I'll just leave it at that. And the self belief that that's achievable.
Hmm.
So, part of the footsteps, as you described, which is a great description, has to do with a lot more of the same with many of these things and what we talked about before and concepts in the book. Right now, at least at the foundation of being able to advocate, be somewhat of an evangelist of sorts for these practical uh, ways of enriching people's lives, and hoping that they identify with it and take to it and just speak my truth. And as I grow, the foundation will grow with me. But ultimately, I know that personal enrichment is, I am working to, keeping it in the present, personally enrich those many people, and thankful here to your audience for being among them.
Well, I'm certainly good luck on that particular journey, and I think anyone who's making a concerted effort to contribute beyond themselves, I think it should be applauded in some way. And I certainly very much enjoy speaking with you, Matt, as the reason I want to have you back on. So,
My website is z-isms.com. Insights to Live By is certainly something that's easy enough to find on Amazon. The reviews have been very kind in both places. Someone can read the first part of the book for free. That's the call to action. I can only hope for that people do that, and they'll decide for themselves if they want to keep reading. The podcast is at insightstoliveby.com, which is to say, I'm not quite sure when this episode is airing. If it was today, you wouldn't find anything at that website, but next week you will.
good. And so for those listening in, this episode will be made available sort of 12th, 13th, 14th of June, and in a week's time, then Matt's podcast will be up and well, very exciting for you. It's very exciting to start a new chapter or a new medium or anything like that. So I wish you good luck with that. And do you have some people lined up for your show yet, Matt?
I actually do. I'm still working on my guest strategy, working backwards from some of the high. I have a meeting today that's going to answer some of those questions, but there are a couple of people I really admire that will be my initial shows, and it's going to be a combination. I'm doing a solo show with one episode a week, and then I'll do an interview show. And
Mm-hmm.
Insights to Live By, Zisms, those being um, pearls of wisdom and things that everybody has. The podcast is about interviewing people about their insights to live by, and those origins, and why, in terms of their value system, those are what resonate for them. That's what what we'll be covering.
Excellent. Well, Matt, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for yours, and for everyone listening. I just really am grateful for your interest, and hope to stay in touch.